Marcos parked his truck just outside the rusted iron gates of the old furniture factory. The building loomed in the darkness, its silhouette jagged against the faint moonlight. Broken windows stared back at him like hollow eyes, and the faded company sign creaked eerily in the wind. A strange chill swept over him as he stepped closer, flashlight in hand. His boots crunched over shards of glass and splintered wood, the sound unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. The air smelled of mildew and oil, but beneath it lingered a faint, metallic tang, like blood long dried and forgotten. Inside, the vast main hall was a cavernous void. Dust swirled in the flashlight beam, revealing rows of abandoned machinery cloaked in thick cobwebs. Marcos hesitated. Something about the space felt wrong. The stillness was suffocating, broken only by faint tapping sounds echoing from somewhere deep within. At first, he dismissed it as the building settling after years of neglect. But as the sound grew louder, more deliberate, his chest tightened with unease. He approached one of the workbenches, where ancient tools lay scattered as if the workers had simply vanished mid-shift. A rusted saw suddenly shifted, teetering on the edge before clattering to the floor. Marcos froze, his breath caught in his throat. The sound reverberated through the empty factory like a gunshot. "Is someone there?" he called out, his voice trembling slightly. There was no answer, only the tapping, now accompanied by a faint whispering that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. His flashlight flickered as he scanned the room. For a brief moment, he thought he saw movement, a shadow darting between the machines. But when he turned, there was nothing. "It's just your mind playing tricks," he muttered, trying to steady himself. Yet, as he took a step forward, his foot hit something soft. He looked down to see a pile of old, decaying fabric. Nestled within it was a small wooden chair, perfectly intact despite the decay around it. He reached out to touch it, and as his fingers brushed the surface, a sharp, cold sensation shot through his hand, like an electric shock. The chair began to rock gently on its own, the faint creak of its movement cutting through the silence. Panic rose in his chest as the whispering grew louder, transforming into indistinct murmurs that filled the room. The tapping sound intensified, morphing into the rhythmic pounding of hammers against wood. The machines groaned to life, their gears screeching as if awakening from decades of slumber. Serrated saw blades began spinning, their high-pitched whine echoing like a scream. Marcos stumbled backward, his flashlight dropping from his hand and rolling across the floor. The beam landed on the far wall, illuminating the faint outline of a figure standing motionless between two machines. He couldn't make out its features, but its presence was undeniable. The figure's head tilted unnaturally, and it raised an arm, pointing directly at him. Marcos's blood ran cold as the factory was suddenly engulfed in a deafening cacophony, the sounds of machinery, hammering, and the guttural growls of something inhuman. The figure dissolved into the shadows as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only the echo of its presence and a chilling realization. Whatever haunted this place had noticed him. If this story gripped you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to Haunted Grounds for more bone-chilling tales. As the factory seemed to breathe around him, Marcos couldn't shake the feeling that he had been here before. His hands still tingled from the icy shock of the rocking chair, and an unease gnawed at the edges of his mind. Walking deeper into the factory, he noticed a doorway partially hidden behind a stack of decaying wooden pallets. The faint smell of sawdust and rot grew stronger as he pushed the pallets aside, revealing a small office that had somehow escaped the ravages of time. The air in the room was heavier, oppressive, as if the space held its breath. On a desk covered in a thick layer of dust, an old ledger lay open, its pages yellowed and curling at the edges. Marcos reached for it, and as his fingers brushed the cover, a strange sensation washed over him, like stepping into a memory not his own. A wave of dizziness made him grip the desk for support as fragmented images flooded his mind. Workers hammering away at furniture, their faces tense. A woman in a red dress standing in the shadows, and finally, the factory floor drenched in blood. Shaking off the visions, Marcos focused on the ledger. The handwriting inside was erratic, as if written in haste. The entries detailed shipments of furniture, but toward the end, the tone grew frantic. "The accidents won't stop," one line read. "The machines seem to have a will of their own. It's as if they crave blood." His breath quickened as he turned the pages, discovering more ominous notes. "We shouldn't have taken that wood. The forest was cursed. Now we are too." As he absorbed the words, a faint tune began to echo through the factory, a haunting lullaby. It was distant at first, but with each passing second, it grew louder, more defined. His heart froze as recognition dawned. It was the same lullaby his grandmother had sung to him when he was a child. The melody carried a distorted, mournful edge, as if the voice singing it was struggling to stay human. He turned abruptly, expecting to see someone behind him, but the room was empty. Yet, he could feel eyes on him, watching from the shadows. On the desk, beneath the ledger, something caught his attention, a small, weathered photograph. It depicted a group of factory workers standing in front of the building. In the center stood a foreman with an unsettling grin, his eyes seeming to follow Marcos even through the aged print. But it wasn't the foreman that chilled him to the core. In the back row, partially obscured, was a figure he recognized instantly, his grandmother, younger but unmistakable. Her expression was grim, her eyes filled with an unspoken warning. Marcos stumbled back, nearly knocking over the desk. How was this possible? She had never mentioned working in a factory, let alone one tied to such darkness. The lullaby grew louder, its eerie cadence filling the air, now accompanied by faint whispers that seemed to chant his name. Panic set in as the shadows in the corners of the room began to shift, coalescing into shapes that moved with purpose. He grabbed the photograph and fled the office, the door slamming shut behind him with a force that rattled the entire structure. Outside the office, the factory had changed. The machinery, once lifeless, now groaned and creaked as if struggling to awaken fully. The lights above flickered, casting erratic shadows that danced like phantoms on the walls. The air was colder, and the smell of sawdust was now mixed with the acrid stench of burning wood. Marcos clutched the photograph tightly, the image of his grandmother a reminder that his connection to this place ran deeper than he ever imagined. Suddenly, the lullaby stopped, plunging the factory into an unbearable silence. Then, from deep within the shadows, came a voice, soft, almost gentle, but layered with a sinister undertone. "You've come back, Marcos. Just like we knew you would." Marcos stood frozen in the middle of the factory floor, the photograph trembling in his hands. The voice that had spoken his name lingered in the air, reverberating as if the walls themselves were alive and repeating it. "You've come back," it whispered again, this time closer, almost at his ear. He spun around, but there was nothing, only the endless rows of machines, each casting long, ominous shadows that seemed to stretch toward him like claws. Suddenly, the machinery roared to life with a deafening cacophony. Saws screeched, hammers pounded, and conveyor belts groaned under invisible weight. Marcos stumbled backward, his flashlight flickering madly as if overwhelmed by the dark energy surrounding him. Then he saw it, the rocking chair from earlier, now in the center of the room, impossibly pristine. It swayed gently, creaking in time with the factory's mechanical symphony. His stomach churned as he noticed something new. Resting on the chair was a journal, its black leather cover pulsing faintly, as if alive. Against his better judgment, he approached the chair, each step heavier than the last. When he reached for the journal, a surge of cold shot up his arm, and a voice, not his own, whispered in his mind, "Take it and see the truth." Marcos hesitated, but the factory groaned impatiently, the noise rising to a crescendo. Reluctantly, he opened the journal. The pages were blank at first, but words began to appear as if written by an invisible hand. "To end the curse, you must make the ultimate sacrifice." The words burned themselves into his mind as images flashed before his eyes. He saw workers screaming as machines tore them apart, the factory floor soaked in their blood. He saw his grandmother kneeling by the rocking chair, clutching a child's toy and sobbing as shadowy figures closed in around her. And then he saw himself, standing in the very spot he was now, his face twisted in terror. A sudden, sharp pain erupted in his chest, and he gasped, clutching at his shirt. Looking down, he saw a faint mark forming on his skin, a sigil, ancient and grotesque, as if etched by unseen claws. The journal's pages flipped violently, stopping on a single message: "Choose. Free the trapped souls or save yourself." The room seemed to darken further, the machines grinding louder, more aggressive. A shadowy figure emerged from the far corner, its form shifting and writhing as if made of smoke and hate. It pointed a jagged, claw-like hand at him, and the voice returned, louder and more menacing. "They paid the price. Now it's your turn." Marcos's mind raced. If he destroyed the journal, perhaps he could break the curse, but the shadows warned of unimaginable wrath. Alternatively, he could leave the factory and never return, preserving his life but condemning the souls within to eternal torment. A memory of his grandmother's sorrowful face haunted him. Her presence here was no coincidence. Was she a victim of the curse, or had she somehow been complicit in it? As the sigil on his chest burned hotter, the shadowy figure advanced, bringing with it a wave of cold that froze him in place. The factory's cacophony became deafening, and the shadows around him began to close in, whispering accusations, pleas, and threats. Decide, they hissed, their voices merging into a single, inhuman growl. Marcos's breath came in shallow gasps as the weight of the choice crushed him. His hands shook as he held the journal, its cover pulsating like a living heart. If he freed the souls, what would become of him? Would he, too, be trapped here, another pawn of the factory's insatiable hunger? But if he fled, how could he live with the knowledge of the suffering he left behind? The shadows pressed closer, their cold tendrils brushing against his skin, waiting for his decision. And then the factory fell silent, the oppressive noise giving way to an unbearable stillness. The voice spoke again, low and final. Time is up, Marcos. What will it be? The factory seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for Marcos's answer. His heart raced as he clutched the pulsating journal, its cold leather cover searing his palm like ice and fire combined. The sigil on his chest burned hotter, its faint glow casting flickering shadows on the walls. But it wasn't just the light creating the movement. Shadows slithered and writhed, detaching themselves from the machinery and creeping toward him with purpose. They carried no solid form, just a mass of writhing darkness that pulsed with malevolence. From the depths of the factory, whispers emerged, low and guttural at first, growing louder with every passing second. The voices were layered, overlapping, and chaotic, as though dozens of unseen entities were speaking at once. They didn't form coherent words, but the tone carried an unmistakable warning. Marcos turned slowly, his flashlight trembling in his grip, only to see the beams of light swallowed whole by the growing darkness. The air grew colder with each step he took, the temperature plunging into an unnatural chill. Frost began to form on the rusted machines, their frozen surfaces emitting faint creaks. His breath fogged the air, and with every exhale, it seemed to form shapes, faces contorted in agony, fleeting but vivid. He shook his head, trying to clear his mind, but the whispers became more distinct, forming fragmented phrases that sent chills down his spine. You shouldn't have come. They will never let you go. The price must be paid. The whispers seemed to flow from all directions, their source impossible to pinpoint. He felt surrounded, trapped in the center of an unseen audience. And then he heard something new, a faint sound beneath the voices, like wood creaking under pressure. It was rhythmic, deliberate, growing louder until he recognized it, the rocking chair. The chair, now positioned impossibly close despite him leaving it behind, swayed slowly in the darkness, its movements perfectly synchronized with the whispers. The sight rooted Marcos to the spot, dread clawing at his chest. A strange glow emanated from the chair, faint at first but intensifying with each swing. He hesitated, torn between the instinct to flee and the compulsion to approach. Something about the chair demanded his attention, as if it held answers, or doom. The glow from the chair pulsed, and the whispers abruptly stopped, replaced by a deafening silence that was almost worse. Marcos took a hesitant step forward, the silence amplifying the sound of his own heartbeat. As he drew closer, he noticed a figure sitting in the chair, its outline barely visible against the darkness. It was small, hunched, and shrouded in shadow, its face obscured. Yet, as he moved closer, the figure slowly tilted its head toward him. A sharp, bone-chilling voice cut through the silence. You've seen what they've done. Now, will you finish it? The figure's voice was neither human nor fully inhuman, a distortion that made Marcos's ears ring. Before he could respond, the figure vanished, dissolving into smoke that spread through the air, thick and suffocating. The rocking chair slammed to a stop, its abrupt stillness unnerving. Suddenly, the shadows surged, crawling up the walls like living entities, their forms shifting into grotesque shapes. Faces with hollow eyes, clawed hands reaching out, and mouths frozen in silent screams. The darkness itself seemed to come alive, encircling Marcos, pushing him back toward the chair. A loud bang echoed behind him, and he spun around to see the office door he had exited earlier now wide open, its interior glowing with an ominous red light. A new whisper emerged, louder and more sinister, emanating from the doorway. There is no escape, Marcos. You must choose. The factory groaned as if alive, its machinery grinding to life again, the cacophony a brutal symphony of terror. The sigil on his chest flared brighter, searing his skin and sending waves of pain through his body. The shadows pressed closer, whispering words in a language he couldn't understand but instinctively feared. The sense of being watched grew unbearable, as though the entire factory had become an entity, its attention fixed solely on him. Marcos stumbled, his knees threatening to give way under the weight of the oppressive darkness. The journal, still clutched in his hand, began flipping its pages wildly, stopping on a single phrase etched in blood-red ink: "One must remain. One must fall." A chill ran down his spine as the meaning became clear. Someone, or something, was not leaving this place alive. And then, in the corner of his eye, he saw it. A shadowy figure standing motionless, half hidden behind the machinery. Its head tilted unnaturally, the same figure he had glimpsed before. Only this time, it didn't disappear. It stepped forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette controlled by invisible strings. As it approached, the whispers crescendoed into screams, and Marcos realized the factory wasn't just haunted, it was hungry. Marcos stood paralyzed, his back pressed against the cold metal of a workbench. The shadowy figure advanced slowly, its twisted form flickering in and out of focus as if caught between this world and another. Its face, or what should have been its face, was a shifting void, swallowing the light around it. But what terrified Marcos most was its eyes, or rather the absence of them. Two hollow voids glowed faintly red, staring deep into his soul. He couldn't move, couldn't scream. The weight of its presence seemed to pin him in place. The whispers returned, louder and more distinct now, filling his head with half-formed words and sinister promises. "We see you. We know you. You cannot hide." They echoed over and over, drilling into his mind. His vision blurred, and the sigil on his chest pulsed painfully, each beat sending a wave of heat through his body. It was as if the factory itself was feeding on his terror, growing stronger with each moment of his hesitation. Then the whispers shifted, taking on a softer, almost seductive tone. "Why do you run, Marcos? This place knows you, remembers you. Stay with us, and all your questions will be answered." The words carried a strange pull, like a siren's song, tempting him to surrender. For a moment, the terror subsided, replaced by a twisted sense of calm. He felt his grip on the journal loosen, his mind clouded by the promise of relief. But as soon as he let the thought take root, the figure lunged forward, closing the gap between them in an instant. A scream ripped from his throat as he stumbled back, crashing into a stack of rotting wood. The figure halted, inches away, its featureless face tilting slightly as if amused by his reaction. Around him, the factory seemed to close in, the walls narrowing, the shadows lengthening. The temperature dropped further, and his breath now came out in short, panicked gasps. As he looked around, the machines began to change. The rusted metal gleamed as though new, and the grinding of gears was replaced by rhythmic hammering. It was as if the factory had been transported back in time, alive with activity. But there were no workers, only shadows mimicking human movements. Marcos's eyes darted to the rocking chair, now vibrating violently in the corner. A figure began to materialize in it, a woman, her features warped and distorted, her head hanging limply as if broken at the neck. The lullaby returned, but this time, it wasn't soft or nostalgic. It was slow, disjointed, and deeply unsettling, like a warped record playing on a broken phonograph. He clutched his ears, trying to block it out, but the sound grew louder, drilling into his mind. As the shadows thickened, Marcos's surroundings became harder to distinguish. He felt as though he was being pulled into another realm, one where the factory was alive, breathing and feeding on his fear. The whispers grew sharper, angrier. "Do you see now? This is where it ends." Images began to flash before his eyes, visions of himself trapped in the factory, his face pale and lifeless, his body absorbed into the machinery. He saw the journal lying on the ground, forgotten, as the shadows dragged him into the void. The air became heavy with the scent of burning wood, and the sigil on his chest flared brighter, illuminating the room in pulses of crimson light. The light revealed dozens of shadowy figures surrounding him, their forms barely human, their faces frozen in expressions of agony. They reached for him, their fingers elongated and claw-like. Every instinct screamed for him to run, but his legs wouldn't move. The journal in his hand began to vibrate, its pages flipping violently. A single word appeared, scrawled in blood-like ink: "Submit." Marcos's vision blurred again, and for a moment, he wasn't in the factory anymore. He was in his grandmother's house, sitting on her lap as she sang the lullaby. The room was warm, filled with the smell of fresh bread and lavender. But as quickly as the memory came, it twisted. The warmth faded, replaced by the icy chill of the factory. His grandmother's face darkened, her eyes becoming hollow pits like the figures. "You can't escape it, Marcos," her voice echoed, distorted and haunting. "You were always meant to return." He fell to his knees, clutching his head as the visions and whispers overwhelmed him. The figure loomed over him now, its clawed hand reaching out to touch his forehead. A deep, guttural voice whispered, "Fear is your truth. Fear is your end." Marcos could feel his sanity slipping, the factory digging into his mind, tearing apart his sense of reality. The line between what was real and what wasn't blurred completely, leaving him lost in a nightmare he couldn't wake from. In the depths of his despair, the journal's glow intensified and a single, deafening thought erupted in his mind: choose. But how could he, when fear had consumed him whole? Marcos knelt on the icy concrete floor, trembling, the journal burning hot in his hands as if alive. The factory around him was no longer merely an abandoned building. It had become a pulsing, breathing nightmare, alive with the echoes of its bloody past. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of burnt wood and metal, each breath feeling like it was being drawn through ash. The shadows surrounding him were no longer just entities. They were watching, waiting, as though the entire factory had become an audience for what was about to unfold. The whispers returned, louder now, a cacophony of overlapping voices that reverberated inside his skull. Some begged, others cursed, and a few laughed, their tones dripping with malice. Marcos's vision blurred as the sigil on his chest flared with a searing light, casting crimson reflections across the walls. He tried to stand, but his legs felt as if they were weighed down by chains. Then the voice returned, deep and guttural, vibrating through his bones. "It is time. The truth awaits you." The journal in his hands began to flip its pages wildly, faster than any natural wind could cause. The words etched in the pages seemed to shift and crawl, forming shapes and symbols he didn't understand but instinctively feared. Finally, the pages stopped, revealing a single sentence written in jagged, blood-red script. "To confront it, you must remember." As he read the words, a piercing scream echoed through the factory, a sound so unnatural and agonizing that it felt as though it came from the depths of the earth itself. The machines around him began to shake violently, gears grinding and metal screeching. Sparks flew from the saws, their blades spinning faster than seemed possible. Then, as if summoned by an unseen force, the shadows parted, revealing the center of the factory floor. There, in a clearing surrounded by rusted machinery, stood a massive wooden workbench. Its surface was marred with deep cuts and stains that Marcos realized, with growing horror, were dried blood. Chains hung from the ceiling above it, swaying gently despite the still air. A faint, ghostly light illuminated the area, and standing beside the bench was the shadowy figure, its hollow eyes glowing brighter than ever. The figure extended a clawed hand toward Marcos, beckoning him forward. With trembling steps, Marcos approached, the journal clutched tightly to his chest. As he neared the workbench, the air grew colder, and the whispers began to form coherent words, each one stabbing into his mind like a dagger. "It was always you. You brought this upon us." He stopped, his body trembling, as the figure raised its other hand, pointing to the blood-stained surface of the bench. The sigil on his chest flared again, and a vision consumed his mind. He was no longer in the factory. He stood in a forest, dense and dark, the trees twisted and gnarled as though they had grown from the nightmares of the earth itself. Before him was a massive tree, its bark blackened and scarred. Men with axes surrounded it, chopping at its trunk, their faces devoid of emotion. Among them he saw his grandmother, her hands clasped in prayer, tears streaming down her face. The tree let out an ear-splitting groan as it fell, and the ground beneath it seemed to tremble with rage. The vision shifted, and he was back in the factory, but not as it was now. The machines were new, gleaming under bright overhead lights. Workers bustled about, crafting furniture from the cursed wood of the fallen tree. But something was wrong. The shadows around the workers seemed to move on their own, reaching out with clawed fingers. One by one, the workers fell, their screams of agony drowned out by the roar of the machines. And then he saw himself, standing by the rocking chair, a child's innocent curiosity etched on his face. His grandmother knelt beside him, whispering something he couldn't hear. The vision shattered, and Marcos was back in the present, standing before the workbench. The shadowy figure loomed over him, its form larger and more defined now, as if it had been feeding on his fear. The whispers grew into a chant, rhythmic and relentless, echoing the words of the journal. "To confront it, you must remember." Marcos placed the journal on the workbench, his hands shaking violently. As he did, the sigil on his chest burned brighter than ever, illuminating the factory in a red glow. The figure stepped closer, its clawed hand hovering above the journal. "You took the first tree," it hissed, its voice a blend of rage and sorrow. "Now you must pay the price." The journal flared to life, its pages burning with an unnatural fire that didn't consume them. The machinery groaned and screamed, the sound deafening. Marcos fell to his knees, clutching his head as the factory seemed to collapse in on itself, the shadows converging around him. Through the chaos, the figure reached out, its clawed hand brushing against his forehead. A rush of memories flooded his mind, his grandmother's warnings, the cursed wood, the workers who had vanished, and the truth he had long buried. The factory fell silent. Marcos opened his eyes, gasping for breath. The shadowy figure was gone, but the workbench remained, glowing faintly in the dim light. On its surface, the journal lay open, its pages blank once more. He looked down at his chest, where the sigil had burned so brightly. It was still there, but its glow had dimmed, leaving behind only the faintest trace of heat. The truth had been revealed, but at what cost? As he stood, the factory groaned, a low, menacing sound that promised the nightmare wasn't over. Marcos stood in the eerie silence, the factory no longer roaring with life, but humming faintly, as if holding its breath. The journal lay open on the blood-stained workbench, its pages blank, yet radiating an ominous energy. The sigil on his chest, now dimmer, pulsed weakly, a grim reminder that the bond between him and the factory was far from broken. He could feel the weight of unseen eyes on him, the factory itself alive, watching, waiting for the conclusion of this twisted game. The shadows around him coalesced once more, pulling together into a massive form in the center of the room. The figure that emerged was no longer just a shapeless entity. It had fully materialized into a towering humanoid shape. Its body was a grotesque amalgamation of wood, metal, and shadow, as if it had been forged from the very fabric of the factory itself. Splinters jutted out from its limbs, dripping with black tar, and its hollow, glowing eyes burned with a fiery intensity. The air grew colder as it took a step forward, the ground trembling under its weight. "You cannot escape what you are," the figure's voice boomed, reverberating through the cavernous space. "This place exists because of you, Marcos. You are its beginning, and its end." Marcos staggered back, his mind racing. "What do you mean? I didn't do this. I didn't." But before he could finish, the figure raised an arm, its clawed fingers slicing through the air. The motion sent a blast of icy wind toward him, knocking him to the ground. The journal flew from the workbench, landing inches from his outstretched hand. The factory roared to life again, machines screeched, hammers pounded, and saws spun wildly. The air was thick with the metallic scent of blood, and the shadows danced chaotically across the walls, their movements erratic and violent. "Lies will not save you," the figure growled. "You must face what you've buried." It raised its other hand, and from its shadowy palm, a vision erupted, playing out in vivid detail before Marcos's eyes. He saw the factory in its prime, bustling with workers and machinery. But something was wrong. Accidents plagued the floor, workers vanished, and whispers filled the air. In the vision, he saw his grandmother, her face etched with despair, pleading with a younger version of himself. "Marcos, you can stop this. You must stop this." But the boy in the vision shook his head, fear and confusion clouding his face. The scene shifted, showing the cursed wood from the fallen tree being processed, its dark energy spreading like a plague throughout the factory. The machinery seemed to twist and groan under its weight, becoming extensions of the curse. The vision ended abruptly, and Marcos found himself back in the present, the towering figure looming over him. "You chose to ignore the warnings," it hissed. "Now you must pay the price." Desperation clawed at Marcos's mind. He scrambled toward the journal, his fingers brushing its edge. But before he could grab it, the figure slammed a massive claw into the ground, splintering the concrete and sending a shockwave that threw him back. The shadows around him swirled violently, forming grotesque faces that screamed and laughed, mocking his every move. "You want redemption?" the figure snarled, leaning closer. Its hollow eyes burned brighter, illuminating the sigil on Marcos's chest. "Then offer yourself. This place demands a soul. Will it be yours, or will you run as they all did before?" Marcos's heart pounded as the weight of the choice bore down on him. The factory seemed to close in, the walls pressing tighter, the air growing thinner. He looked at the journal, its pages now glowing faintly, and then at the figure, its shadowy form writhing with anticipation. Every instinct screamed at him to flee, but he knew there was no escape. The factory was alive, and it would hunt him no matter where he went. In a moment of clarity, Marcos remembered his grandmother's words from the vision. "You can stop this. You must stop this." Taking a deep breath, he rose to his feet, his legs shaking but his resolve hardening. "If it's my soul you want, take it," he shouted, his voice trembling but defiant. But this ends here. No more lives will be taken because of this curse. The figure paused, its massive form looming over him, as if considering his words. The shadows stilled, and for a brief moment, the factory fell silent. Then, with a deafening roar, the figure lunged forward, its clawed hand slamming into Marcos's chest. Pain erupted through his body as the sigil burned brighter than ever, its fiery glow engulfing the room. He screamed, the sound drowned out by the cacophony of the factory collapsing around him. As the light consumed everything, Marcos felt himself falling, the world fading into darkness. The last thing he saw was the journal, its pages turning one final time before bursting into flames. The shadowy figure dissolved into smoke, its hollow eyes the last to disappear. When the light faded, the factory was gone. Marcos awoke on the ground outside, the dawn breaking over the horizon. The journal was nowhere to be seen, and the sigil on his chest had vanished, leaving behind only a faint scar. The factory was silent now, its curse seemingly broken. But as he stood, a faint whisper carried on the wind, "It is never truly over." Marcos turned and walked away, his shadow stretching long behind him, as if something unseen followed close at his heels. Marcos left the factory behind as the first light of dawn crept across the horizon. His body ached, his mind reeled, and the faint scar on his chest tingled as if it still held the factory's mark. The cursed place was silent now, its machinery stilled, its shadows gone. Yet, as he walked away, an unsettling feeling clawed at him, a lingering sense that the nightmare was far from over. The air felt heavier as he reached his truck, its surface coated in a fine layer of ash that hadn't been there before. His reflection in the cracked side mirror startled him. His eyes looked sunken, his face pale, and for a brief second, he thought he saw something move behind him, a shadow flitting across the horizon. He turned quickly, but the road behind him was empty. Shaking off the feeling, he climbed into the truck, started the engine, and drove away, leaving the factory to rot in its isolation. The ride home was quiet, almost too quiet. The usual hum of the tires against the road felt muted, the outside world distant. As the morning sun rose higher, it seemed to cast an unnatural glow, and the trees along the road swayed gently, though there was no wind. Marcos couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. He glanced at the rearview mirror repeatedly, expecting to see something, anything, lurking in the back seat. But each time it was empty. Still, the unease in his chest refused to subside. When he finally reached his house, he was too exhausted to do more than collapse onto his couch. The events of the night played in his mind, vivid and unrelenting. The journal, the sigil, the monstrous figure. It all felt unreal, yet his scar and the memories were proof it had happened. He tried to rest, but the moment he closed his eyes, the whispers returned, faint and distant, like an echo from another world. That night, he dreamt of the factory. In his dream, it was whole again, its machinery polished and gleaming, its workers alive but expressionless, moving like puppets on strings. The shadowy figure loomed over them, orchestrating their every move, its hollow eyes fixed on Marcos. The dream ended with a deafening screech as the factory floor collapsed beneath him, plunging him into darkness. He woke with a start, drenched in sweat, his chest burning where the sigil had been. The room was eerily quiet, but something felt off. The air smelled faintly of sawdust and burning wood, and the rocking chair in the corner, a piece of furniture he didn't remember owning, swayed gently on its own. He stared at it, frozen, as the faint sound of a lullaby drifted through the room, warped and haunting. The melody was unmistakable. It was the same as grandmother had sung to him as a child. The whispers followed, barely audible at first but growing louder with each second. "It is never over." The words repeated over and over, blending with the sound of the rocking chair's creak. Marcos stood, his legs trembling, and approached the chair. As he reached out to stop its movement, his hand froze inches from the wood. The scar on his chest flared painfully, and in the faint light of the room, he saw the sigil reappear, glowing faintly beneath his skin. Panic surged through him as the chair suddenly stopped rocking. The lullaby ceased, and the whispers fell silent. But the quiet was short-lived. From the corner of the room, a shadow began to stretch across the floor, its shape shifting and twisting as it moved toward him. Marcos backed away, his heart pounding, but the shadow grew, rising from the floor until it formed a familiar figure, the monstrous entity from the factory. Its hollow eyes burned brighter than before, and its voice rumbled through the room. "You thought it ended there? You were wrong. You are bound to me, Marcos. To this curse. Forever." The walls around him seemed to dissolve, replaced by the familiar, oppressive darkness of the factory. The smell of oil and blood returned, and the faint sound of machinery hummed in the background. Marcos found himself standing in the center of the factory floor once more, the journal lying open at his feet. The figure loomed over him, and the shadows writhed with malicious glee. "Your sacrifice was not enough," the figure hissed. "You belong to this place now. You always have." Marcos screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the factory, his voice echoing endlessly into the void. The shadows closed in, and as they enveloped him, he saw glimpses of his grandmother, the workers, and the countless souls claimed by the curse. They stared at him with hollow eyes, their faces twisted in anguish, their mouths moving silently as if begging for release. The next morning, the factory was quiet once more, its machinery dormant, its shadows still. Locals who passed by claimed they saw faint lights flickering inside and heard the distant sound of hammering and saws. But no one dared enter, not after hearing the whispers. And among them, a new rumor began to spread, that if you listened closely at night, you could hear the cries of a man trapped inside, forever bound to the factory's curse. Marcos was never seen again, but the rocking chair he once owned appeared one day on the factory's doorstep, swaying gently in the wind. It was said that if you sat in it, you would hear a voice, a man's voice, begging you to destroy the factory and end its curse. But no one ever stayed long enough to find out. And so the factory remained, an eternal monument to fear and mystery, waiting for its next victim.